and I shall return. 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 This has been Mediocre Minis, and I shall return. I'm back. Greetings, and welcome back to Mediocre Minis. It's been a bit. Sorry about that. This time, we're going to be painting another miniature, part of the 40K My Way series. And with this one, we're going to go with one of my favorites and one of the most badass members of the Avengers. That's right, we're going with Black Widow. For this project, we're going to use a few different techniques, such as layering and a little bit of blending, to be able to get a really nice color scheme going on Black Widow. Now, I know that most of her uniform is black, with a tiny little bit of red and some gold. Well, that's a little bit not as exciting, so I'm doing something a little bit different. For this, I'm going to be making most of her armor and her cloak on the miniature a shade of red, deep colored red, and also adding in some gold and some white to flesh out the rest of the miniature. So, let's get started.
So for the base coat I use Abaddon Black, Scale 75's Mayhem Red, and Dragon White by Reaper. I took approximately a 50-50 mix of the black and red and mixed them together to get a very deep red, and I used this as a base coat, and I covered the entire miniature that was, or would be, normally black. This made things a lot easier, as the miniature was already painted black to begin with, so if I missed anything, it would blend in very nicely. And then over time, I just added more and more of the red into the black and red mixture, and it got lighter and lighter and closer to the red's true color. And then I just went and I layered more and more of the paint on there. If you do this fast enough, especially when the paint is still wet, you can blend them together. This is called wet blending, and it's kind of a tricky technique, but it ended up working out very nicely. As you can see here, I'm adding just a more and more of the red into the mixture, so I was able to essentially brighten up the cloak and also parts of her armor. One thing to remember when you're working with paint is it will dry a little bit darker, so when you see it now when it's wet, it looks pretty stark in contrast to everything else. However, over time, it will actually darken up as it dries. This difference is a little bit more extreme whenever you end up using relatively thin paint, so the contrast will be very, very large at first, but over time it will work out. In the base coat, the brown, I end up using Morphang Brown and New Gold.
You're painting gold. Why are you starting off with a brown? Well, one of the reasons why I'm starting off with a brown base coat for all of the gold trim is mostly because brown works as a very nice base coat for many shades of gold. When you have that type of brown, it can help warm up and liven up the gold. When you use a brown that has a little bit more of your oranges and reds, it can become a little bit warmer as opposed to having more greens or blues in your brown. So when you put that down as a base coat and then the gold on top of it, it actually can make the gold pop a little bit more. Now, I could have used a warmer shade or a lighter shade of brown, but I decided to go with Morphang Brown because, one, that's what I have, and two, I figured it would look really, really nice.
So all the parts that I wanted to be gold, I just gave it a quick coat of the Morphang Brown and let that dry. At first it does look relatively weird having brown where you're eventually going to have gold, but again, it makes a very, very nice base coat for any shades of gold, especially if you want it to be brighter and a little bit more vibrant. I also made sure to get the hilt and parts of the sword also, which would eventually be covered in the gold. And clearly the footage of me putting on the gold is missing, or out of frame more specifically, but after it's done you can see it stands out and it looks very, very nice in contrast to the black and red that we use for the base coat on the rest of the miniature. And now I'm using a bright white to go over some of the areas of Black Widow that I wanted to stand out. Now it looks very, very bright right now, but eventually I will use some washes and some other layering to dull that down so it doesn't stand out too brightly in comparison to everything else. One of the great things about painting miniatures is when you put down a layer of paint, you can easily make it brighter or darker however you want actually, with just a few other paints and putting more different types of things on top of it, such as wash.
Now we're going to move on to one of my favorite parts of miniature painting, the highlights.
For the highlighting, I use Screamer Pink and also Dragon White. Screamer Pink is probably one of my favorite colors now, so... Part of the edge highlighting process is going over every single little detail, such as edges of the armor, ends and edges of the cloak, and even other berries on the gloves, to stand out. This can be a very slow and delicate process, but I really enjoy it because now the miniature really starts to pop and almost come to life with the highlighting aspect. With the highlighting done, I moved on to the sword with lead belcher, turquoise, and a small amount of polished silver. Even though in the end the silver didn't work out the way I wanted it to, it was fine. And the blue really stood out against the reds and golds of the rest of the miniature, so I chose blue and I'm very happy with how it turned out. And if you ever use too much blue or doesn't go where you want it to go, you can always just go back over it again with the silver. Eventually I used two shades of the same blue, a little bit darker, and I kind of blended them together, almost like there was a transition at the sword was getting brighter the closer you get to the tip.
After working on the sword, I decided that maybe we could bump up those highlights a little bit. Increasing your highlights and contrast to the shadow is, well, contrast. Most miniatures are somewhat over-exaggerated in some way because they're so small and you don't look at them very closely. So I decided to go back with some more Screamer Pink and boost up those highlights a little bit more.
So in order to do some of the brighter highlights, what I did was take some of the Screamer Pink and added some white to it. Very small amounts over time, and makes the color a little bit more desaturated, a little bit brighter to the eye. And then I went over and re-edge highlighted. Now one thing you can do is you can highlight a smaller and smaller area with brighter and brighter paint, or more desaturated paint. This kind of gives it an interesting effect where it seems like it's getting brighter towards the tips and also making a relatively sharper contrast. I ended up doing this several times before I ended up using a 1:1 ratio of the Screamer Pink and White to get my brightest highlight, and again, it will get darker as it dries, but it ended up looking fantastic. Moving on to the head, I use Cadian Flesh Tone, Kislev Flesh, Blood Red, and Magma Red. After priming the head black and putting it onto a pin, I was able to go in there with the darkest red that I had and coloring in and filling in all of the hair. How about that framing? With Reaper paints, they are generally a little bit thinner, so it might take several coats to go over an entire area, especially if it's already primed black. After putting down the base coat of the flesh tones, I then went in and did some highlights, very similar to how I've done other highlights in the past. You can also see that I dotted the eyes with white. Again, I really like to do all of the eyes before I move any further because it's very easy to fix whenever you put in the white. And it was relatively difficult because the eyes are very small. And the same highlighting that I've done before with other hair and also with the armor itself, adding brighter and brighter shades of red to eventually add some more dimension and depth to all of Black Widow's hair. She is a fiery redhead after all.
So normally I would show some of my basing work, such as what colors I used and how I went around painting the base. But guess who didn't film anything in frame? Yeah, sorry about that. So I ended up doing a very simple gray scheme on all of the bricks and boulders and rocks behind or underneath Black Widow. And then I topped it off with some gravel, some few grass tufts to really liven it up a little bit, very similar to how I did my other 40k bases. And even though I don't have any footage of me really putting on the basing materials on, what I do have is some pretty sweet glamour shots. Yes, I know one of the rocks looks like a giant piece of corn. But there we have it. Black Widow is complete, and this now is 4 out of the 6 original Avengers from the MCU. And what that means is that now we have 2 more to go, Hawkeye and the Incredible Hulk. So I hope you enjoyed this video, something a little bit different, looking into Black Widow and another member of the Avengers as part of the 40k universe. If you like this video, please feel free to leave a comment below. I would love to hear about what you think and what you would like to see potentially more of in the future. Also, if you haven't already done so, liking and subscribing does help a small channel like this out, and it does boost up my ego a little bit. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed painting it. I have a few other projects and a few other ideas that will be hopefully coming our way soon, but until next time, I've been Brian, and I shall return.